Welcome back. This is session 4 and we're going to talk about creating a great first impression. What did you think when you first saw the background that I was using for this series of videos? Did it create an impression that was different to the normal course of videos that you might see in terms of learning about public speaking or improving your public speaking skills? It's all part of creating an impression before I start talking. Now, I've come from a long and illustrious career in public speaking, but I first started out working in the construction industry, and that was in the 70s, and it wasn't a place where there was a lot of women, particularly in positions where they were training the men that came onto the site. And often when they would come to the training room, the first thing they would say when they walked through the door was, "Oh, it's a girl," which I was very pleased about. That first impression would set the tone for the rest of the training session. And so I needed to ensure that they moved past what they perceived as my knowledge and my ability because of my gender in that particular instance. But when you're doing your presentations, you need to think about, as we talked in previous sessions, you need to think about who's in the audience, what is the impression they already have of you, and how can you create a different impression or build on that impression if that's what you want to do in terms of the presentation that you're going to give. So we're going to look at the shortcuts, the ways that you can do that, the ways that you can have a standard presentation or beginning of a presentation that will help you to be comfortable about getting started on a presentation. It will help you create a particular impression. The other thing you can do is think about, when is the impression going to be made? It's often not when you start speaking, it's well before that. It's when they see you before the session starts. It's when you're introduced into the session. So all of those things you need to take into consideration when you're doing your preparation, when you're doing your planning. You think about, how is your first impression going to be made on this particular audience? As a general rule of thumb, we judge others in the first 90 seconds of our first interaction. What that means for you in your presentation is that you'll have less than 2 minutes when you start to make a positive impression on your audience. After that, you can certainly still impress them, but their initial reaction will affect the amount of attention they pay and the overall message that they get from your presentation. Now, you might feel like 30 seconds is not really a long time, but let's think about TV or radio advertising. How long does an advertiser wait before making an impression on you? How long do you stay focused on the advertising if that impression is not favourable? In fact, the basic unit of advertising these days is 30 seconds. So if advertisers recognise that this amount of time is appropriate to get their message across, so you'll spend money, it should certainly be enough time for you to make a great impression on your audience. The first impression that you make, as with the advertising, sets the tone for your presentation. And it's true even when the audience thinks they know you or have seen you speak before. The first impression that you make needs to put your audience at ease, as well as spark their interest to see what you've got to present to them. What you're aiming for is that the audience needs to know you, like you, and trust you. Now, obviously, some of those things are not going to happen automatically in that first 30 seconds, but that's the aim of what you're doing in that creating that first impression. Is that how you feel about presenters that you enjoy? Does that first impression stay with you? It's a bit windy here today, but we'll press on. First impressions happen well and truly before your presentation. Now, a first impression can happen after you start to speak, and that's an impression, but it's not the first impression. The impression that people are going to come to your presentation with is important. And when we looked at the preparation of your presentation, we looked at knowing the audience. So you know the audience, you know who's going to be there. If you don't know them, if this is a new group to you, then try and get out before your presentation and get a feel for the audience, get a feel for the information, get a sense of what they're expecting from the presentation. The other important thing to consider, and we've talked about it in previous sessions in preparing your written presentation, is knowing your audience. One of the things that you can do is arrive early to the venue at which you'll speak.
Move around amongst the group of people that are there when they're having coffee, or sitting on the beginning of a meeting if it's possible, if you're presenting at a meeting. Observe as much as you can and have a flexible enough presentation to be able to adapt it as a result of your study of the audience. Now, how often might you go to perhaps a seminar you're presenting at and you wander around at the beginning of it and there's a bit of a buzz, but there's also a fair bit of concern about whether the information is going to be useful or interesting, or what time is lunch, or when is the next break, all sorts of things that people might be talking about beforehand or organising beforehand, and you can get a sense of whether this group is independent or whether they're a cohesive group, and that might help you in your presentation. One of my favourite presenters is the Scottish comedian Billy Connolly, and I know that when he's in a venue where he's going to present for, often it's 9 or 10 nights in a row, he will walk from wherever he is staying to the venue to get a sense of the arriving crowd, to get a sense of the excitement, and I think it builds him up as well. But it's certainly, I think it's something that he uses. I have heard him talk about something he's seen or someone he's talked to on the way to the venue during the performance itself. So his presentation is obviously flexible enough, but what it also does, and we're going to talk about that in a little while, is it gives him a connection, it gives the audience a connection with him. Be Sherlock Holmes. Observe everything.
Regardless of how well you think the audience knows you, you should have an introduction. You should have a set format that you follow that gives out an impression that you want the audience to have before you start to speak. So you have a range of pre-prepared introductions. It's part of managing your image and managing the impression that you want to give to this audience that you're talking to today.
Now, using your introduction is a way to help you ease yourself into the presentation and to create an impression that will stay with your audience. Firstly, you should listen carefully to the introduction made for you, and I've talked a little bit about having introductions that are pre-prepared that you hand over so that you know what's going to be said in the introduction, and you can then have that reflected in the speech that you've already written. There may well be something, if it's not your own introduction, there may well be something in it that you can respond to immediately and give yourself that connection with the audience. Mentioning something from the introduction shows your audience that you're not performing an automatic presentation, that this isn't the same presentation you do time and time again. As well as it respects the person who's introduced you. They've made an effort to introduce you. It's hard for them to get up in front of a crowd and say something as well. The next thing you can do is connect with the audience. Now, I've touched on this briefly a few times already. Smile and look around the audience, even when the topic is not a pleasant one. It doesn't have to be a grin. It can just be an acknowledgement smile. Practice those sorts of things in the mirror so that you know how your face feels when you're doing that sort of thing. Make eye contact with a few people, whether you know them or not, so they can feel, and the audience feels, that you're interested in making this presentation relevant to them, that you know you're speaking to someone that's not just this blank room or sea of faces. Don't rush this step, this connection with the audience. Don't rush it, because it gives you time to relax your breathing, and we're going to talk about that in another session that is specifically about breathing. And it focuses your attention to the presentation. It takes you away from the introduction and from the time beforehand, and it brings you to the moment. Be in the moment. Then, and only then, you start to speak. Always begin by thanking the person who introduced you using their name. When it's appropriate, you thank the group for inviting you to speak, and you have some piece of local relevant information you can share. So this is where I talked about Billy Connolly relating an anecdote of something that happened to him on the way to the venue. It makes people feel that they're part of the presentation. What it's not about is how long or how far you've travelled, or how many presentations you have to do, or how many times you've done this presentation. It is about this group and your connection with them on this day for this presentation.
Once you've started speaking, you'll be able to gauge what the impression is that you're making on this audience. And we're going to talk in another session about how you tell whether anyone is listening to what you've got to say, and how you adjust your presentation if you think it's appropriate to that particular circumstance.
Now, in summary, I want you to remember that it's always useful to listen as much as you talk, to know who will be listening, understand why they'll be listening, understand why you are talking to them, why they might listen to you.
When you look out into the audience, when you first start to speak and you see that there's a sea of frowning faces, crossed arms, sitting sideways on the chair, you're going to have a reaction yourself. You're going to think, well, they're not interested in what I've got to say, they're dead against what I've got to say, whatever it is. And if you haven't prepared yourself beforehand, if you haven't given the audience an impression that might give them the idea that perhaps you've got something different and interesting and valuable to share with them, then you've got an uphill battle. It won't matter what you say, how well you present it, you're behind the 8 ball before you start. So the importance of preparation, of knowing your audience, of getting that introduction right, is paramount in these situations. Conversely, of course, if you decide that you look out at the audience and they're all sitting there anticipating what you've got to say, before the presentation they've all been very upbeat and happy about being there and hearing what you've got to say, then you need to ensure that the first impression that you give is that you're happy to be there as well, that you're interested in presenting the information that you've got to them so that they can do something with it. That's why it was so important in that previous session to get to know your audience, to get to understand who is in the audience and why you're talking to them, so that the impression that you make can be a calculated one, or it can be a building on the impression that they already have of you in your particular role and the reason that you're talking to them in this particular presentation. How do you start a presentation for impact? This is when you've actually started to speak. What is it that you say, or how do you begin your presentation so that the audience is on the edge of its seat, so that they are with you on this journey of information that you're presenting? Now, I will go through just now some catchphrases that I use and I've used very successfully for a number of years, and it helps me in writing the presentation, but it also helps me knowing that every time I get up to present, I'm going to use a certain phrase that I'm comfortable with. It's going to help me prepare myself for the presentation ahead. So it settles me to know that the opening is going to be in a particular way, and I know that it's a way that works, and so that's always a good thing when you know that what you're going to present is useful and informative and will catch their attention and will have them listening for the next thing that you've got to say. Then that makes your job easier.
Many of you will feel it's actually more difficult to start a presentation than to finish it, but it's actually the other way around. So I would recommend that you work back from your conclusion or your call to action and find an appropriate opening that matches the presentation itself and the call to action or the conclusion that you've got, so that your presentation starts with something that is the impression that you want these people to take away with, and it ends with something that gives them something to do or tells them what the outcome is. So it's all interrelated. Let's have a look at a few effective impression starters. These are ones that I use very effectively, I must say. You use a phrase to spark attention, you can use a date to create interest, or you can ask a rhetorical question. So if we look first of all at using a phrase to spark attention, remembering that this is going to have to be related to the conclusion or the call to action that you've got in your presentation. It can be a well-known phrase or quote, such as beware of the Ides of March, or life is a bowl of cherries. Something that people will recognise straight away. Now obviously if you know that your audience, and in knowing your audience you will know whether they've come from a background where these will be familiar phrases to them. If they're not, don't use them. Simple as that. Something that is an occasion or workplace specific, such as perhaps a sentence from your mission statement that they should all know. The second way is to use a date to create interest. This is something that I use as the default position to start most of my presentations these days, because I find that it helps me to know that I'm going to start that way, and so I don't have to think about what the start is going to be. I write the rest of the presentation, I have my conclusion, my call to action, and then I think about all of that information, and then a date will provide itself to me, and so I just go back and put the date in and then I'll talk about something that is relevant to that date in the starting paragraph of the presentation. And I've used it, I have to say, from every situation, from welcoming newcomers to an organisation to eulogies. It's easy to keep it relevant. It's simple to remember and to say, and I use the format day, date, time of day because it gives me extra impact and time for the audience to focus on me, and also time for them to think about what that date might mean or what they were doing on that date, or it just creates that interest that makes them start to listen, start to focus on what I've got to say. Pause between each part of the date where the commas are in this example that you'll see. So we would say Tuesday, March 24, 1995, 9:30 a.m. And so you can see that how that stretches out the date and makes people start to focus. They mightn't hear the first couple of words, but by the time you've got to the end of it, they're focused, they're ready to listen to you, and they've got an impression that you've got something important to say, because dates are important to us. We've been drilled in that situation. So the third way you can do it is to ask a rhetorical question. And we use the classic question words or phrases: who, why, what, where, when, do you know, do you realise. Now those last two, I will say to you that I use do you know and do you realise rather than did you know or did you realise, because in my ears, did you know sounds condescending. It's like, I have this information and I'm not sure whether you really are aware of it or not. Whereas do you know is a shared experience. It's a shared exploration of what I'm going to talk about next. And the same for do you realise and did you realise. Don't wait for an answer, but look for a reaction. Keep the question relevant to the presentation and immediately show how your presentation will answer this question. And that can be a roadmap of what you're going to talk about, or it can be a simple statement. And it's not about being like a real estate agent showing someone around a house. Real estate agents we always think of as tour guides, because what do? They take you into the house, they open the door and they say, this is the lounge room, as if you wouldn't know by looking at it that this is the lounge room, this is the bathroom, this is the bedroom, where in fact they could say something that was descriptive of the room so that you had an idea of what the uses of it were, where you were going next, that sort of thing. So it's about roadmap and involvement of the audience in the question that you're asking. Start strong with this starter phrase or question or date, but not confrontational. So again, it's about the words and it's about the tone and the volume of your voice. Have a presence or a look, so that apart from the words that you're using, there is a visual impression that you give people when you walk into a room or when you stand up in front of an audience. Now I know that my hair is quite daunting for a lot of people, but it creates an impression every time anyone sees me. It creates an impression when I'm walking down the street, anywhere in the world, I can tell you. What it does for me though is that I actually forget that it's like that. And when people notice it, it gives me a sense of I've created an impression. You need to do that too. You need to have something that creates an impression as soon as you walk into the room. Be congruent. Your body language has to match your words. Now, I saw very recently a presentation by a CEO introducing a very exciting new piece of technology, and he looked like he was desperate to be anywhere but where he was. He didn't sound excited. He certainly didn't look excited. And he looked down the whole time. You could never see his eyes. You could never see his full face. He didn't move his arms at all. It was just that my impression was, without listening to his words, that the whole of his body had shut down and shut me out in the audience. But he had to be there. So you need to be congruent with your message. A first impression is created by your appearance, by your tone of voice, and then by your words.
So it's all of the hidden signals that happen first before you actually get to say anything. So make sure that all of that is congruent with what you want to say, with the message that you're going to impart, with the information that you need to share, with the task that you need these people to take on after you've given your presentation.
Well, there we have it. There's some ideas for you to create a great first impression with your presentation. The next session we're going to look at is session 5, and that's where we're going to discover whether anyone's actually listening to you. I'll see you there.